Gilded promises, cracks in the facade. This resolve, this ember of defiance glowing in the face of annihilation, wasn't born in an instant. Oh no, it was forged in the dying embers of a love Elara Vance once believed was her everything, a love she thought as boundless as the empire's Julian Thorne commanded. It all started so differently, as these things often do, under a canopy of glittering illusions. Before the storm, there was a fairy tale. Or so Elara Vance let herself believe. The genesis of their whirlwind courtship could be traced to an evening dripping with diamonds and forced smiles, the annual Starlight Gala for the Sanctuary Children's Hope Hospital. Elara, a gifted interior designer whose talent far outweighed her current renown, was there as a guest of a grateful client. She'd felt a little out of her depth, a sparrow among peacocks, until Julian Thorne, the Midas King himself, had seemed to materialize before her. He wasn't just handsome, he was a force, a magnetic field that warped the very atmosphere around him. His eyes, the color of aged whiskey, had a way of making her feel like she was the only person in a room of hundreds. "Lost?" he'd murmured, his voice a low velvet rumble that sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. His smile wasn't the predatory glint she'd seen on other titans of industry that evening. It was disarming. Almost boyish, if a boy could command billions with a flick of his wrist. And just like that, Elara, the woman who designed dream spaces for others, found herself swept into one. Julian Thorne, a name synonymous with power and untouchable wealth, pursued her with the same focused intensity he applied to his business takeovers. But this felt different. Flowers arrived daily, not just any flowers, but rare orchids and blooms she'd only ever seen in botanical journals. He'd whisk her away to private dinners at l'Étoile Filante, where Michelin stars seemed to dim in comparison to the sparkle in his eyes as he listened, truly listened, to her talk about her passion for sustainable design and creating spaces that nurtured the soul. He spoke of his own grand visions for Thorne Imperium, not of ruthless expansion, but of legacy, of shaping a better world, or so he claimed. It was a fairy tale romance, a dizzying ascent into a world she'd only ever glimpsed from afar. She fell. Hard. Who wouldn't? Their wedding was the event of the decade, a lavish spectacle at the Celestial Hotel that graced the covers of society magazines worldwide. Elara, radiant in a custom Silvana Ricci gown that seemed spun from moonlight and stardust, felt like she was floating. The vows they exchanged, his voice resonant with promises of eternal devotion, echoed in the grand ballroom, sealing what she believed was an unbreakable bond. As he slipped the diamond onto her finger, its cold fire a stark contrast to the warmth of his hand, she'd never felt more cherished, more secure. What a fool she'd been. Life in their sprawling penthouse, a glass-walled eyrie overlooking the glittering cityscape, was initially an extension of that dream. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased a panorama that took her breath away each morning. Every surface gleamed, every artifact was priceless. Julian, in those early days, was attentive, showering her with gifts, praising her impeccable taste as she slowly transformed the somewhat sterile opulence into a home. Yet, even then, there were peculiar notes in their symphony. Julian's study, a room she rarely entered, housed his strange, almost obsessive collection of antique hourglasses. Dozens of them, crafted from wood, silver, and even obsidian, lined the shelves. Some were massive, ornate things. Others were small, delicate. When she'd once asked about them, a shadow had flickered in his eyes. "They remind me of the fleeting nature of opportunity, Elara," he'd said, his tone uncharacteristically somber. "And the importance of seizing every moment." It was an odd explanation, one that didn't quite settle right, like a perfectly placed cushion that still felt lumpy. It was a small, almost imperceptible curiosity then, a tiny splinter under the skin of her perfect happiness. The initial bliss, as all illusions must, began to fray. Slowly at first, then with increasing, undeniable speed. The attentive husband who had hung on her every word became the controlling husband who subtly, then overtly, began to sculpt her life to his preferences. Her career, once a source of shared enthusiasm, became a charming little hobby. He'd question her client meetings, suggest she take on fewer projects, his voice laced with a possessiveness that masqueraded as concern. "You don't need to work, my love," he'd say, stroking her hair. "You have me." The words, meant to reassure, began to feel like gilded bars. Then came the secretive late-night calls, hushed conversations in his study with the door firmly closed. Business trips became more frequent, often sprung on her with little notice, his explanations vague, his eyes evasive. The emotional distance grew, a chilling fog rolling in between them. She'd try to talk to him, to voice the growing unease in her heart, but he'd skillfully deflect, or worse, make her feel as though her anxieties were a failing on her part. "You're too sensitive, Elara," he'd sigh, his fingers steepled. "The pressures I'm under, you wouldn't understand." He made her feel small, insignificant. It was during this period of escalating chill that Elara discovered she was pregnant. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over her. Fear, yes, given the growing iciness in their marriage, but also a desperate, surging hope. A baby. Their baby. Surely this would be the bridge to span the chasm that had opened between them? Surely this would remind Julian of the love they once shared, the future they had so eagerly planned? She'd pictured his face lighting up, the surprise, the joy. She clutched the positive test to her chest, a fragile prayer in her heart. She chose an evening when he seemed less burdened, a rare night when the ghosts of Thorn Imperium didn't follow him home. He was in his study, one of the larger, ornate hourglasses slowly sifting sand on his mahogany desk. The soft hiss was the only sound for a moment. "Julian," she began, her voice softer than she intended. He didn't look up from the report he was reading. "Yes? I have some news. Something wonderful." He finally lifted his gaze, his eyes coolly appraising. "Oh?" She took a breath, her hand instinctively going to her still flat stomach. "I'm pregnant, Julian. We're going to have a baby." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the relentless whisper of the sand in the hourglass. Elara's hopeful smile faltered. Then, a small, almost imperceptible muscle twitched in his jaw. He looked from her to the report, then back to her. "That's efficient," he said finally, his voice utterly devoid of warmth, of any emotion she could recognize. He then turned back to his papers, as if she'd merely commented on the weather. Efficient. Her heart, which had been soaring with a fragile hope, plummeted. The word was a slap, a cold, clinical dismissal of the miracle growing within her, of the love she still desperately clung to. Tears welled, blurring the image of the man she thought she knew. She wanted to scream, to demand he look at her, to see her, to feel something. But the chill in his eyes, the utter finality in his posture, froze the words in her throat. She backed away, a choked sob escaping her lips, the grand, opulent room suddenly feeling like a mausoleum. He didn't even flinch. Later she would rationalize. He was stressed, overwhelmed. The news was unexpected. He just needed time. Empty justifications, whispers against the hurricane of her dawning horror. Weeks passed, each day a heavier stone in the wall between them. The pregnancy announcement, instead of mending the cracks, seemed to widen them into gaping fissures. Julian was more distant than ever, his absences longer, his explanations, when offered, even more perfunctory. Elara retreated into herself, a lonely castaway on an island of luxurious despair. One evening, as she passed his study, she heard his voice, low and urgent, a tone she hadn't heard him use with her in months. It was a hushed call, the words indistinct but a single name, a woman's name, drifted out, clear and sharp as a shard of ice. Serafina. The name hung in the air, alien and ominous. An inexplicable chill snaked down Elara's spine, a premonition of a truth far uglier than she could yet imagine. Julian, sensing her presence, ended the call abruptly. He turned, and his eyes, when they met hers, were not just cold. They were like frozen Arctic wastes, devoid of life, devoid of her. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence was a confirmation of something terrible, something she was not yet ready to face. But the ice in his gaze was a warning. And the name Serafina was a brand, seared into her mind, a harbinger of the devastation to come. That name, Serafina, echoed in Elara's mind for weeks, a dissonant note in the carefully composed symphony of her marriage, a phantom haunting the opulent corridors of her gilded cage. It was the first thread she pulled, unknowingly, at the edge of Julian Thorne's meticulously woven tapestry of lies. His icy gaze that night had been more than a dismissal. It was a warning, a silent command to retreat from a truth he clearly intended to keep buried. But Elara, though bruised by his increasing coldness, was not one to be so easily deterred when her heart whispered of betrayal. Not anymore. A subtle shift occurred within her. The woman who had once floated through life on a cloud of naive trust began to observe her husband with a new, unwelcome acuity. It wasn't a conscious decision, more a survival instinct kicking in, the way an animal senses a predator before it strikes. She watched Julian more closely, cataloging the late nights that stretched into dawns, the hushed phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered a room, the faint, unfamiliar scent of perfume that sometimes clung to his expensive suits, a fragrance too floral, too overtly seductive to be her own. Each observation was another small, sharp stone added to the growing weight of her unease. He was an artist of evasion, his explanations for his prolonged absences and secretive meetings always plausible, yet hollow. "Board meetings, darling," he'd say, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "International finance, it's a demanding mistress." The irony of his phrasing would later make her stomach churn. The charade of their perfect marriage was expected to be on full display at the Thorn Imperium's annual Midsummer Gala, an event that commanded the attention of the city's elite. Elara, dressed in a gown of sapphire silk that Julian had personally selected, another small act of control she'd barely registered at the time, played her part. She smiled, she mingled, she was the gracious, beautiful wife of the Midas king. But beneath the practiced composure, her senses were on high alert, and then she saw them. Across the glittering ballroom, amidst a throng of sycophants and power brokers, stood Julian. He was leaning in, his expression animated, a warmth in his eyes she hadn't seen directed at her in what felt like an eternity. And the recipient of that warmth? A woman of arresting beauty, with a cascade of raven-black hair and eyes that seemed to smolder with a predatory intelligence. Her manicured hand rested, perhaps a fraction too long, on Julian's forearm, her laughter a throaty melody that seemed to draw him closer. Elara didn't need an introduction to know. This was Serafina Dubois, a rising, ruthless star in international finance, a name now seared into Elara's consciousness. Their body language wasn't just familiar, it was intimate, a silent conversation that excluded everyone else, most pointedly Elara. A wave of nausea, cold and sharp, washed over her. It wasn't just jealousy, though that was certainly a bitter component. It was the chilling dread of confirmation, the ugly unveiling of a truth she had desperately tried to deny. The public humiliation of it, the brazenness, cut deeper than any private suspicion. Later that night, after the last guest had departed and the forced smiles had been packed away with the fine china, Elara confronted him. The penthouse, usually a symbol of their shared success, felt like a battleground. "Who is she, Julian?" Elara's voice was quiet, dangerously so, but it trembled despite her efforts. Julian, loosening his bow tie, didn't even turn from the vast window overlooking the sleeping city. "Who is who, Elara? You'll have to be more specific. I spoke to dozens of people tonight." His casual dismissal was a well-honed weapon. "Serafina Dubois," Elara stated, the name a foreign object on her tongue. "You seemed exceptionally close." He finally turned, and the charming mask he wore for the world was gone. In its place was an irritation, a flicker of something cold and hard. "Serafina Dubois is an important business associate from our European division. We were discussing the new sovereign wealth fund. Is that a problem?" "The way you were looking at her, the way she touched you, that wasn't business, Julian." Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. She could feel the ground shifting beneath her. A harsh laugh escaped him. "Oh, for God's sake, Elara, are you truly this insecure? After everything I've given you, this palace, the clothes on your back, a name that opens doors?" He advanced on her, his voice rising with each word. "Serafina Dubois is a brilliant, ambitious woman, something you clearly wouldn't understand, content as you are with your little design projects." The condescension was a physical blow. "My little design projects are my career, Julian. Something you used to admire," she shot back, stung. "This isn't about insecurity, it's about what I saw. It's about your lies, your absences." Julian's face contorted with rage, a terrifying transformation. "Lies? I give you a life beyond your wildest dreams, and you accuse me of lying?" He was shouting now, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Perhaps your peasant insecurities are showing, Elara. Perhaps you're simply not cut out for this world, for my world. You're becoming a tiresome, paranoid burden." The fight was brutal, his words like acid, stripping away the last vestiges of her fairy tale. He gaslighted her, twisted her concerns into accusations of madness, of inadequacy. She was left shaken, hollowed out. The image of him and Serafina Dubois burned into her memory. He slept in a guest room that night, and the nights after. The chasm was now a canyon. And then, the story violently snapped back to the cold, hard present of the opener. It was a Sunday morning, a few weeks after that soul-crushing fight. Julian was away on another extended business trip to Singapore, his communication dwindling to curt, impersonal texts. Elara, 6 months pregnant and feeling every ounce of her emotional and physical exhaustion, had been trying to find a paint swatch for the nursery, a small act of hope in an increasingly desolate landscape. That's when the courier arrived, a crisp, embossed envelope from Thorn Imperium. Not unusual, but this one felt different, heavier. Her hands trembled as she tore it open. The language was cold, formal, meticulously crafted by lawyers who specialized in severing inconvenient ties. Divorce. A request, no, a demand, that she vacate their shared residence within 7 days. 7 days. The prenuptial agreement, the one he'd dismissed as a mere formality, just in case, darling, to protect the family legacy, was being enforced with ruthless precision. No alimony. No property rights beyond the personal items she had brought into the marriage. Nothing. She read the lines again, and then a third time, each word a hammer blow against the fragile remnants of her world. Her stomach churned. 7 days to leave the only home she'd known for nearly 3 years, while 6 months pregnant with his child. His child. The cruelty was breathtaking, a calculated strike designed to obliterate her. The antique locket around her neck, a gift from her grandmother, suddenly felt like a lead weight, cold against her skin. It was meant to be a symbol of enduring love, of family. What a bitter mockery that felt now. She sank onto a plush velvet ottoman, the letter falling from her numb fingers. The opulent penthouse with its panoramic views and priceless art transformed before her eyes into a luxurious prison, its beauty a cruel taunt. Disbelief warred with a tidal wave of despair. This couldn't be happening. Not Julian. Not their life. But the stark, unyielding words on the expensive stationery screamed the truth. Hours passed in a blur of shock and gut-wrenching sorrow. She tried calling him, of course. Straight to voicemail. She texted long, rambling pleas for an explanation, for a conversation, for any shred of human decency. No response. The silence from his end was as absolute and unforgiving as the terms in the letter. It took every ounce of her will not to shatter into a million pieces, not to succumb to the hysterics clawing at her throat. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. There was a tiny, innocent life inside her, a life that depended on her, a life Julian Thorne had just callously discarded along with its mother. As dusk began to paint the city in hues of bruised purple and gray, a different emotion began to stir amidst the wreckage of her despair, a tiny, flickering ember of anger, of defiance. He thought her disposable. He thought he could erase her, erase their child, with the stroke of a pen and an ironclad prenuptial agreement. He thought her weak, a tiresome, paranoid burden. The memory of his sneering words fueled the nascent flame. Her fingers, still trembling but now with a different kind of energy, scrolled through the contacts on her phone. Past the society acquaintances, the business contacts Julian had insisted she cultivate, to a name she hadn't called in months, but one that represented an unwavering anchor in the stormy seas of her past. Lena. Lena Petrova. Her fiercely loyal, no-nonsense childhood friend, the one who had always seen through every charade, every pretense. The one who would tell her the unvarnished truth, no matter how brutal. Elara's thumb hovered over the call button, a silent prayer on her lips. This was it, the first step out of the abyss. The voice on the other end of the line was a balm to Elara Vance's shattered spirit, a lifeline thrown into the churning chaos of her despair. Lena Petrova didn't hesitate, didn't ask for lengthy explanations, her tone a familiar blend of fierce loyalty and pragmatic warmth. Get out of there, Elara. Now. Come to me. My couch isn't the celestial, but it's safe. We'll figure this out together. And just like that, with those simple, unwavering words, the first stone was laid on the path to war. 7 days. Julian Thorne, in his infinite arrogance, had given her 7 days to disappear, to be erased. He had no idea he'd just given her 7 days to become his worst nightmare. Packing was a surreal, heartbreaking blur. 2 suitcases. That's what her nearly 3 years as Mrs. Julian Thorne boiled down to. Each item she touched, a silk scarf he'd admired, a framed photo from their early happier days, a tiny soft baby blanket she'd bought in a moment of secret joy, felt like a fresh stab to the heart. The penthouse, once her sanctuary, now felt alien, a mausoleum of broken dreams. The doorman, a kindly man named George who had always greeted her with a warm smile, averted his gaze as she exited the glittering tower for the last time, his expression a mixture of pity and something that looked disturbingly like fear. He knew. Of course he knew. In Julian's world, loyalty was a commodity and secrets were currency. The taxi ride to Brooklyn was a journey through a landscape of grief. Manhattan's glittering skyline, once a symbol of her fairy tale life, now seemed to mock her. Each towering edifice a monument to Julian's power and her own naivete. Where would she go? What would she do? The questions hammered at her, relentless and terrifying. Lena's apartment in a pre-war Brooklyn brownstone was a world away from the sterile opulence of the Thorne penthouse. It was smaller, filled with the comfortable clutter of a life well lived. Overflowing bookshelves, vibrant textiles, the scent of brewing coffee, and something indefinably Lena. It was real. It was safe. And Lena herself, with her fiery red hair and even fierier spirit, was an anchor in Elara's storm-tossed sea. She didn't coddle. She fortified. She listened, her expression growing stormier with each revelation of Julian's cruelty. Then she made Elara eat, drink tea, and finally, sleep. For 2 days, Elara moved through a fog of grief and shock. The weight of Julian's betrayal, the sheer, calculated cruelty of his actions, threatened to crush her. But then something shifted. Perhaps it was Lena's unwavering practical support, or perhaps it was the gentle, insistent flutter of the life within her, a tiny warrior already making its presence known. The despair began to recede, replaced by a slow-burning anger, a cold, hard knot of determination forming in the pit of her stomach. She remembered Julian's sneering dismissal, "Your peasant insecurities, a tiresome, paranoid burden." One evening, curled on Lena's worn velvet couch, a mug of chamomile tea warming her hands, Elara looked at her friend, her eyes no longer clouded by tears but glinting with a new, steely light. "He wants to erase me, Lena?" she said, her voice low but vibrating with an intensity that surprised even herself. "He wants to pretend his child doesn't exist? He thinks he can just discard us like yesterday's trash?" She shook her head, a bitter smile playing on her lips. "He's picked a fight with the wrong woman." Lena, who had been quietly observing her friend's metamorphosis, nodded slowly. "Damn right he has. But Elara, this isn't a street fight. This is Julian Thorne. You can't go up against him with just righteous anger. You need a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. You need a shark, a killer." A shark. The word resonated with Elara. She needed someone who wouldn't be intimidated by Julian's wealth, by the formidable legal machine of Thorne Imperium. The next few days were a blur of online research, sifting through endless lists of high-powered divorce attorneys. Names blurred, reputations merged. Then, late one night, hunched over Lena's laptop, a name seemed to leap off the digital page of an Apex magazine article, titled "The Titan Slayers: 10 Lawyers Who Make Billionaires Tremble." Vivian Holloway. The article described her as brilliant, relentless, a legal tactician with a reputation for dismantling ironclad prenuptial agreements for an elite, often embattled clientele. There was a photo, too. A woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, an elegant, severe haircut, and an expression that brooked no nonsense. A shiver, not entirely of fear, ran down Elara's spine. This was her shark. The walk to Vivian Holloway's Midtown office a few days later was one of the longest of Elara's life. Each step was a battle against the tremor in her legs, the knot of anxiety in her chest. What if Vivian Holloway wouldn't see her? What if she couldn't afford her? What if even this renowned Titan Slayer deemed Julian Thorne too powerful, too untouchable? But with each step, the image of Julian's cold, dismissive face, the memory of his cruel words, fueled her resolve. She clutched the small, antique locket at her throat, its familiar weight a tiny point of certainty in a sea of unknowns. Vivian Holloway's offices were the epitome of sleek, understated power. No ostentatious displays of wealth, just cool marble, muted tones, and an almost reverent hush. Vivian herself was exactly as the magazine had portrayed her. Sharp, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, her handshake firm, her gaze direct and unnervingly perceptive. She ushered Elara into a corner office with a breathtaking view of the city, a view that, ironically, included the distant, glittering needle of the Thorn Imperium Tower. "Miss Vance," Vivian began, her voice calm, melodic yet underscored with steel. "Please, tell me everything." And Elara did. She recounted the fairy tale courtship, the lavish wedding, the subtle, insidious erosion of her confidence, Julian's growing coldness, his dismissive reaction to her pregnancy, the shocking affair with Serafina Dubois, and finally, the brutal, calculated cruelty of the divorce papers. She spoke for nearly an hour, her voice sometimes trembling, sometimes raw with pain and anger, but she didn't break. Through it all, Vivian Holloway listened intently, her expression unreadable, her intelligent eyes never leaving Elara's face. Only once, when Elara mentioned Julian Thorn by name and the global reach of Thorn Imperium, did a fleeting, almost imperceptible expression cross Vivian's face, a flicker of something unidentifiable, like a distant memory or a long-held resolve, there and gone in an instant. It was so quick, Elara almost doubted she'd seen it. Almost. When Elara finally finished, a heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the distant hum of city traffic. Vivian leaned back in her leather chair, her fingers steepled. "Mr. Thorn," she said, her voice soft but edged with a dangerous quiet, "believes he's untouchable, Miss Vance. He believes his wealth and his army of lawyers make him impervious to consequence." A predatory glint sparked in her eyes, a chilling counterpoint to her composed demeanor. "We are about to teach him a very expensive, very public lesson in humility." She paused, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. Prenuptial agreements, even those drafted by the most formidable firms, can burn. Especially when there's evidence of significant bad faith. Coercion. Elara felt a surge of something she hadn't dared to feel in weeks. Hope. Raw, terrifying, exhilarating hope. "You'll take my case?" she whispered. "Miss Vance," Vivian Holloway said, her smile widening slightly, "it would be my distinct pleasure." The way she said it sent another shiver down Elara's spine, but this time it was a shiver of anticipation, of alliance. Vivian then leaned forward, all business. "Now our first steps are critical. We need to build an arsenal. I want every piece of evidence you can recall. Every suspicious text message, every unexplained absence, every whispered promise he made that wasn't in writing, every photograph, every gift, every memory, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. We need to reconstruct the timeline of his deceit." As Vivian outlined their initial strategy, Elara felt a transformation begin within her. The broken, discarded wife was receding, and in her place, a warrior was being forged. She clutched her locket, its cool metal a grounding presence. The road ahead would be brutal, she knew that. Julian would fight dirty. But for the first time since that devastating Sunday morning, Elara Vance didn't feel entirely alone. She had an ally. She had a plan. The fight was on. And Julian Thorn had no idea what was coming. Hope was a dangerous currency in a war against Julian Thorn, a man who bought and sold souls with the ease others traded stocks. Vivian Holloway knew this. The moment Elara Vance, a potent mix of vulnerability and burgeoning steel, had walked out of her office, the formidable lawyer had set her intricate machinery in motion. The hunt for truth, and for Julian Thorn's myriad vulnerabilities, had officially begun. Julian Thorn's world was built on secrets, layer upon devious layer. Vivian Holloway, with her network of discreet operatives and a mind like a steel trap, was about to become his most dedicated and feared archaeologist. Vivian's team moved with the silent efficiency of a shadow army. Private investigators, ghosts in expensive suits, materialized in the periphery of Serafina Dubois's glamorous life, documenting her every move, every clandestine meeting. They were good. Very good. They charted her liaisons with Julian, her extravagant shopping sprees that mysteriously coincided with transfers from nebulous Thorn Imperium subsidiary accounts. Simultaneously, forensic accountants, a breed of digital bloodhounds, burrowed deep into the labyrinthine finances of Thorn Imperium. They waded through shell corporations, offshore accounts, and convoluted transactions designed to obfuscate and conceal, searching for the telltale scent of impropriety, of marital assets diverted and hidden. It was meticulous, painstaking work, like piecing together a shattered mosaic in the dark. Days turned into weeks filled with whispered updates, encrypted files, and the quiet hum of an investigation tightening its noose. Elara, ensconced in Lena's Brooklyn haven, tried to focus on her pregnancy, on rebuilding some semblance of normalcy, but the shadow of the impending battle loomed large. Then, an unexpected crack appeared in Julian's fortress of deceit. An email, cryptic and cautious, landed in Vivian Holloway's secure inbox. The sender claimed to be a former high-level executive assistant at Thorne Imperium, someone who had once been in Julian Thorne's inner circle, privy to his secrets, until Julian's ruthlessness had become too much to bear. The name was Marcus Sterling, a name Elara vaguely recalled. Julian had once sneeringly referred to him as a disappointingly sentimental associate he'd had to streamline. Streamline. Julian's euphemism for destroy. A clandestine meeting was arranged. In a dimly lit anonymous coffee shop far from the glittering towers of Midtown, Elara, accompanied by a watchful Vivian, met Marcus Sterling. He was a pale, nervous man, his eyes haunted by things he'd seen, things he'd been forced to do. He clutched a worn leather-bound ledger as if it were a holy relic. "He destroyed lives, Miss Vance," Sterling whispered, his voice hoarse, his gaze darting nervously towards the door. "Mine was one of them. I tried to appeal to his decency. There isn't any." His hand trembled as he pushed the ledger across the table towards Elara. This is just a fraction of it. It shows how he siphoned company funds, millions for Serafina Dubois. Lavish gifts, private jets, entire offshore accounts set up in her name, all masked as operational expenses or client entertainment. Elara's breath hitched. The sheer scale of the deception was staggering. Sterling leaned closer, his voice dropping further. "And those hourglasses he collects? You've seen them? In his study?" Elara nodded, a cold dread creeping up her spine. "Those strange, silent sentinels. They're not just decorations, Miss Vance," Sterling said, his eyes filled with a mixture of bitterness and fear. Each one marks a betrayal. A company he gutted, a hostile takeover where he ruined livelihoods, a so-called friend or associate he systematically destroyed to get what he wanted. He told me once, in a moment of drunken candor, that they were his trophies. Each grain of sand, a moment of someone else's life slipping away, all for his gain. Elara felt a wave of profound sickness wash over her. The man she had married, the man she had loved, was a monster. The hourglasses, once a mere curiosity, now seemed like grotesque monuments to his sociopathy. This revelation, more than anything, solidified the image of Julian not just as an unfaithful husband, but as a deeply corrupt and morally bankrupt individual. The fight wasn't just about her anymore. It was about exposing him for what he truly was. But Julian Thorne was not one to be hunted without baring his own fangs. As Vivian's investigation quietly gathered momentum, Julian's high-priced legal hounds from Lockwood and Crestwell launched a vicious counter-offensive. The tabloids, always hungry for scandal, suddenly found themselves inundated with salacious anonymous tips, painting Elara as a scheming gold digger, a social climber who had entrapped the unsuspecting billionaire and was now trying to extort him. Old photos were dredged up, her modest background twisted into a narrative of desperate ambition. They even stooped to leaking veiled suggestions that questioned the paternity of her unborn child, a particularly cruel blow designed to break her spirit and discredit her in the eyes of the public. The onslaught was relentless, brutal. Each headline, each snide insinuation felt like a fresh wound. The stress was immense, and Elara often found herself fighting back tears of rage and humiliation, the weight of the public smear campaign pressing down on her. Yet, with Lena's steadfast support and Vivian Holloway's cool strategic guidance, Elara found a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. "They want you to break, Elara," Vivian had told her, her voice devoid of false comfort but firm with conviction. "They expect you to crumble under the pressure. We will not give them that satisfaction. We fight fire with meticulously documented, irrefutable facts." And fight they did. Vivian Holloway was a master chess player in the brutal game of high-stakes divorce. For every move Lockwood and Crestwell made, Vivian had a counter. She didn't engage in mudslinging, but strategically, precisely, she began to leak carefully vetted pieces of information to respected independent journalists who valued facts over sensationalism. Stories began to emerge that subtly questioned Julian Thorne's carefully cultivated image as a philanthropic titan. Whispers of financial irregularities within Thorn Imperium, of a pattern of ruthless business practices, began to surface, slowly turning the tide of public opinion. The narrative was shifting. No longer a simple case of a jilted wife, but something far more complex, far more damning for Julian. The tension arc of the investigation, the dizzying highs of discovery, the crushing lows of Julian's attacks, all culminated one rainy Tuesday afternoon. Elara was at Vivian's office, reviewing depositions, the legal jargon a thick fog in her tired brain. Vivian's private line, the one reserved for urgent communications, buzzed. She answered, listened intently, a slow, grim smile spreading across her face, a smile that sent shivers of anticipation down Elara's spine. Vivian hung up the phone, her eyes alight with a triumphant, almost feral gleam. "That was our private investigator in Italy, Elara." Elara sat up straighter, her heart pounding. They'd been tracking Serafina Dubois. It seems Mr. Thorne's recent critical merger trip to Asia included a rather lengthy, undocumented detour. Vivian paused for dramatic effect, savoring the moment. "They have him, Elara. Photographic evidence. Julian Thorne and Serafina Dubois, looking very, very cozy at a secluded, ultra-luxurious villa on Lake Como. A villa, I might add, that was purchased last year through an untraceable shell corporation based in the Cayman Islands." Elara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Vivian's smile widened. "And the villa's name, Elara? Get this." She leaned forward, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "It's called Sanctum Interius, the inner sanctum." She let out a short, sharp laugh. "The irony is almost poetic, wouldn't you say? His very own private sanctuary for his illicit affairs, funded by who knows what." Lockwood and Crestwell are going to have a delightful time trying to explain this one. A wave of relief, so potent it was almost dizzying, washed over Elara. They had him. They truly had him. The price of truth had been steep, paid in tears and sleepless nights, but this felt like the beginning of the end for Julian Thorne. The damning evidence from Lake Como, the irrefutable proof of Julian Thorne's duplicity at Sanctum Interius, was the arrow nocked in Vivian Holloway's perfectly weighted bow. The courtroom, hushed and expectant on the first day of the trial, was where she intended to let it fly, straight into the black heart of Julian Thorne's empire of lies. Julian, the Midas King, arrived flanked by his phalanx of legal eagles from Lockwood and Crestwell, a confident, almost bored smirk playing on his lips. He surveyed the packed courtroom, his gaze briefly flicking over Elara with cool disdain before settling on his lawyers with an air of invincibility. He truly had no idea he was walking into his own meticulously planned dismantling. The courtroom was a coliseum, and Julian Thorne clearly expected a swift, brutal execution of Elara Vance's audacious hopes. He forgot one crucial thing. Even self-proclaimed gods and gladiators can fall, especially when they're too arrogant to see the sharpened spear aimed at their Achilles' heel. The air crackled with a palpable tension, a mixture of media frenzy, high society curiosity, and the raw, thrumming undercurrent of a battle for justice. Presiding over the proceedings was Judge Alastair Finch, a man renowned for his sharp intellect, his even temper, and his utter intolerance for courtroom theatrics or attempts to subvert the law. His stern visage and piercing gaze promised a fair hearing, but also one that would tolerate no fools. Julian Thorne sat at the defendant's table, the picture of unruffled power, his expensive suit a testament to his status, his expression one of bored dismissal. He occasionally whispered to his lead counsel, a shark named Alastair Cromwell, whose reputation for aggressive, take-no-prisoners litigation was legendary. Across the aisle, Elara sat beside Vivian Holloway, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She tried to project an aura of calm, but inside, a storm raged. And there, in the gallery, like a venomous orchid in full bloom, sat Serafina Dubois. Her raven hair was swept back in an elegant chignon, her designer suit impeccable, her expression a mask of icy composure. She met Elara's gaze once, a flicker of triumph, of smug superiority, in her dark eyes before she turned away. Her presence was a calculated insult, a brazen declaration of her victory. Or so she thought. Vivian Holloway rose, her presence commanding the room's attention. Her voice, when she began her opening statement, was deceptively soft, yet each word landed with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Your Honor," she began, addressing Judge Finch, "this is not merely a case of a marriage gone awry, a simple parting of ways. This is a story of calculated deceit, of profound emotional abuse, and the cynical manipulation of a prenuptial agreement designed to leave a pregnant woman destitute, stripped of her dignity and her future, by a man who wields his immense wealth and power like a cudgel. Vivian then painted a vivid picture of Ian's systematic campaign to isolate and control Elara, his blatant infidelity, and the callous timing of his decision to discard her upon learning of her pregnancy. She spoke of the Thorn Imperium not as a business, but as a weapon Julian used to enforce his will. Cromwell, for the defense, was equally polished, his voice smooth and persuasive. He portrayed Elara as a vindictive, emotionally unstable woman, a gold digger who, having signed a perfectly valid prenuptial agreement with her eyes wide open, was now attempting to extort a fortune from her benevolent, long-suffering husband by sensationalizing their private affairs and using her pregnancy as a bargaining chip. "Mr. Thorn," Cromwell intoned, "has been nothing but generous. This circus is a desperate attempt to tarnish a good man's name for personal gain." Elara flinched, but Vivian's reassuring glance steadied her. The witness testimonies began, each one a carefully placed stone in the edifice of Vivian's case. Marcus Sterling, Julian's former executive assistant, was visibly nervous but resolute. He presented the ledger, its damning entries meticulously detailed by forensic accountants. He spoke of the systematic misuse of Thorn Imperium funds to finance Julian's lavish lifestyle with Serafina Dubois, the undeclared gifts, the private jet excursions, the secret accounts. "He called them discretionary expenses, Your Honor," Sterling stated, his voice gaining strength. "But they were payments for a mistress, a life built on lies, paid for by shareholders and deception." He then recounted the chilling truth about Julian's collection of hourglasses, each one a macabre trophy signifying a corporate conquest or a personal betrayal. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even Judge Finch's eyebrows rose slightly. Next came the security guard from the opulent villa on Lake Como, flown in under a cloak of secrecy. His testimony was concise, unshakable. He confirmed Julian Thorn's and Serafina Dubois' frequent intimate stays at the secluded estate, Sanctum Interius, corroborating dates that directly contradicted Julian's alibis of critical business meetings in Asia. The presented photographs, Julian and Serafina lounging by the pool, their arms around each other, looking very much like a long-established couple, were irrefutable. Serafina Dubois, for the first time, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her icy composure showing the faintest of cracks. Then it was Elara's turn. Walking to the witness stand felt like traversing a field of broken glass, each step a painful reminder of what she had lost, what had been stolen from her. But as she sat there, facing Julian, facing the court, a surprising strength flowed through her. Vivian guided her gently through her testimony, her voice a calm anchor. Elara spoke of the early days, of her love for Julian, the hope she had held for their future. She spoke of his gradual withdrawal, his cruelty, the devastating impact of his infidelity, and his cold dismissal of their child. Her voice broke only once when she described the day she received the divorce papers. Then, gathering herself, she held up the small, antique locket that always rested against her skin. "This was my grandmother's," she said, her voice clear and steady, her eyes meeting Julian's across the courtroom. "She gave it to me on my wedding day. It represents family, loyalty, fidelity, things I believed we shared, things he clearly knows nothing about." The locket, once a symbol of lost love, now glinted under the courtroom lights as a testament to her enduring values, her quiet defiance. Cromwell's cross-examination was as brutal as expected. He twisted her words, questioned her motives, insinuated she was mentally unstable, a liar, a gold digger. But Elara, coached by Vivian, held her ground, answering each venomous question with a quiet dignity that seemed to infuriate him more. The true courtroom drama, however, unfolded when Julian Thorn himself took the stand. He strode in with his customary arrogance, confident in his ability to charm and manipulate. He denied everything, of course. The affair with Serafina? A close professional collaboration. The misused funds? Standard executive perquisites. The prenuptial agreement? Signed willingly by Elara, who was, he implied, far more astute about financial matters than she let on. Then Vivian Holloway began her cross-examination. It was not an interrogation, it was a vivisection. Calmly, methodically, she presented Julian with his own lies, his own contradictory statements, a mountain of irrefutable evidence, the flight itineraries that placed him in Lake Como, not Asia. The credit card statements detailing extravagant purchases for Serafina, the damning entries from Marcus Sterling's ledger, the intimate emails and texts that belied any claim of a purely professional relationship with Ms. Dubois. "Mr. Thorne," Vivian asked, her voice like silk wrapped around steel, holding up a photograph from Lake Como, "you testified that your trip to Italy in May of last year was a brief, solitary retreat for business strategy. Is this you, strategizing, alone?" Julian's eye twitched. "Miss Dubois was in the region for her own business. We merely coincided." "Coincided in the same secluded villa, registered under a shell company for 10 days, Mr. Thorne? The same shell company that also paid for Miss Dubois' new Maserati?" Vivian's questions were relentless, each one backed by a meticulously documented exhibit. Julian's carefully constructed composure began to visibly crack. His face flushed, his answers became clipped, evasive. He, who was accustomed to controlling every narrative, every room he entered, found himself cornered, exposed. The Midas King was losing his gilded touch. "You find this amusing, Miss Holloway?" he finally snarled, his voice dripping with venom, losing the carefully modulated tone he'd maintained. "You think you can destroy me with these fabrications, these half-truths peddled by disgruntled former employees and hysterical women?" Objection. Cromwell was on his feet, but the damage was done. "Mr. Thorne," Judge Alistair Finch's voice cut through the courtroom like a whip crack. "You will control your outbursts. You will answer counsel's questions respectfully, or I will hold you in contempt. Is that understood?" Julian Thorne, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, looked genuinely flustered, his arrogance momentarily extinguished by the judge's stern rebuke. He mumbled a "Yes, Your Honor," his face a mask of barely suppressed fury. The cracks in his facade were no longer hairline, they were gaping fissures. He was unraveling, right there for the entire world to see. The closing arguments were delivered. Vivian's a masterpiece of legal reasoning and impassioned advocacy for justice. Cromwell's a desperate attempt to salvage his client's shredded reputation. Then, an almost unbearable silence descended as Judge Alistair Finch announced he would retire to review all evidence and testimony. Days later, the courtroom was once again packed, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Elara sat beside Vivian, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly, her breath catching in her throat. Julian Thorne sat ramrod straight, but the arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by a grim, tight-lipped tension. Serafina Dubois was conspicuously absent. Judge Alistair Finch entered, his expression grave. He took his seat, adjusted his robes, and began to read from the lengthy document before him. His voice was measured, devoid of emotion, yet every word seemed to hang in the supercharged air. Having meticulously reviewed all evidence presented, including extensive financial record-tronic communications and the testimonies of all witnesses, Judge Finch began, his gaze sweeping the courtroom before landing, with pointed intensity, on Julian Thorne. "This court finds Mr. Julian Thorne's conduct throughout this marriage, and particularly in its dissolution, to be characterized by a disturbing pattern of deceit, manipulation, and a callous disregard for the emotional and financial well-being of his wife, Ms. Elara Vance." He continued, detailing the evidence of financial impropriety, the clear intent to mislead Miss Vance regarding the prenuptial agreement, and the coercive control Julian had exerted. Elara felt Vivian's hand gently squeeze hers. Then Judge Finch arrived at the crux of the matter. Regarding the prenuptial agreement executed on, he cited the date. While such agreements are generally held to be valid, their enforceability is predicated on principles of good faith, full disclosure, and the absence of duress or unconscionability. He paused, his eyes fixing on Julian, whose face, once ruddy with confidence, was now an alarming shade of gray, almost ashen. Elara held her breath, her own hand tightening on her belly. The world seemed to stop. The silence in the courtroom stretched for an eternity, each tick of the ornate clock on the wall a hammer blow against Elara's taut nerves. Then, Judge Alistair Finch's voice, clear and unwavering, sliced through it. "Therefore, this court deems the prenuptial agreement executed by Miss Elara Vance and Mr. Julian Thorne, under these circumstances of proven deceit, financial impropriety and profound coercive control on the part of Mr. Thorne to be unconscionable and largely unenforceable. A collective gasp swept through the gallery. The sound of Julian Thorne's sharp, choked intake of breath was audible even over the sudden rustle. His ashen face, moments before a mask of strained composure, now seemed to crumble, the illusion of invincibility shattering like one of his precious ill-gotten hourglasses. Elara felt Vivian's hand gently squeeze hers, a silent affirmation. She could breathe, finally. The gavel fell, not just on a legal case, but on an empire of deceit, on a legacy of cruelty. Judge Finch, his voice resonating with the weight of the law, continued, delivering the full, devastating verdict. The core provisions of the prenuptial agreement were indeed nullified. Elara Vance was awarded a substantial financial settlement, one that reflected not just her share of the marital assets Julian had tried so desperately to conceal, but also punitive damages for the egregious emotional distress and reputational harm she had suffered. Full, generous child support for their unborn child was mandated, along with a trust to secure the child's future. And in a final, stinging rebuke to Julian's arrogance, he was ordered to cover all of Elara's extensive legal fees. Justice, it seemed, had a hefty price tag, and today, Julian Thorne was footing the bill. He sat slumped in his chair, his shoulders sagging, the Midas King stripped of his golden aura, looking small and utterly defeated. His lawyer, Alistair Cromwell, wore the grim expression of a man who knew he'd been comprehensively outmaneuvered, outclassed. The immediate aftermath was a maelstrom. Julian Thorne's carefully constructed reputation, already battered by the strategic leaks during the trial, imploded in spectacular fashion. The court's findings of financial impropriety and misused company funds, as detailed by Marcus Sterling's ledger, triggered immediate and intense investigations by the SEC and other financial regulatory bodies into the opaque dealings of Thorne Imperium. Headlines screamed of his downfall, his carefully cultivated image as a philanthropic visionary, replaced by that of a ruthless charlatan and a vindictive spouse. Serafina Dubois, ever the opportunist, was among the first to abandon the sinking ship. Within days, her public relations team released a terse statement claiming she had been grossly misled by Mr. Thorne, and expressing her profound regret for any unintentional distress caused to Ms. Vance. It was a hollow, self-serving gesture, but it signaled the end of her association with the disgraced tycoon. Julian Thorne was, for the first time in his gilded life, truly alone, facing not just public humiliation but the very real prospect of criminal charges and financial ruin. Elara, flanked by a beaming Vivian Holloway, faced the throng of reporters outside the courthouse, not with triumph, but with a quiet, profound relief. Tears streamed down her face, yes, but these were not the tears of despair she had shed in those first agonizing days. These were tears of catharsis, of vindication. Her hand rested gently on her stomach, a protective gesture that spoke volumes. When asked for a statement, her voice, though soft, was clear and unwavering. "Today," she said, her gaze sweeping over the assembled media, "justice was served. Not just for me, but for my child, and for any woman, any person, who has ever been made to feel powerless, silenced, or erased by those who believe their wealth or position places them above accountability. This was never just about money. It was about truth. It was about dignity." Vivian stood beside her, a silent, powerful affirmation of Elara's strength. Months later, the harsh glare of the courtroom and the relentless media spotlight had faded, replaced by the soft, hopeful glow of a new beginning. Elara had moved into a beautiful, light-filled apartment in a quieter part of the city, a space that felt like hers, filled with her own carefully chosen pieces, her own energy. With a portion of the settlement, she had relaunched her interior design business, Aurora Designs, named for the new dawn she felt breaking in her life, and for the daughter she now held in her arms. She specialized in creating nurturing, sustainable spaces, environments that promoted healing and well-being, a stark contrast to the cold, calculated opulence of her former life. Lena Petrova, ever her steadfast friend, was there, helping to paint the nursery in soft lavenders and hang whimsical fairy lights above a beautiful, handcrafted crib. Laughter, genuine and light, once again filled Elara's days. One sunny afternoon, Vivian Holloway stopped by, a bouquet of vibrant sunflowers in her hand. "The place looks wonderful, Elara. she said. Her eyes, usually so sharp and analytical, softened with genuine warmth as she looked at the peacefully sleeping baby Aurora in Elara's arms. "Thank you, Vivian," Elara said, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything. I don't know how I could have done this without you." Vivian smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "You did the hardest part, Elara. You chose to fight. You found your voice when he tried to silence you. I just helped clear the path." As she spoke, Vivian's gaze drifted for a fleeting moment to her own elegant briefcase resting on a nearby table. Elara didn't see it, but for an instant, Vivian pictured an old, silver-framed photograph on her credenza back at the office. A photo of a younger woman, her own sister, whose bright future had been cruelly extinguished years ago by a man much like Julian Thorne, a man Vivian had, in her own way, been fighting ever since. A small, almost imperceptible nod acknowledged a private victory, a long-held debt finally, partially, repaid. The fire in Vivian Holloway's belly burned for more than just billable hours. Later that evening, Elara sat in the quiet nursery, gently rocking Aurora. The baby's tiny hand clutched her finger, a surprisingly strong grip. Elara looked down at the antique locket resting against her chest. For so long, it had been a painful reminder of broken vows, of a love that had turned to ash. But now, as she touched its cool, familiar surface, its meaning had transformed. It was no longer a symbol of Julian's betrayal, but a testament to her grandmother's enduring love, a link to her own heritage, and a quiet emblem of her own hard-won strength and resilience. She had faced the sovereign of deceit, the Midas king who turned everything he touched to cold, hard currency, and she had not only survived, but she had emerged stronger, truer to herself. She was no longer defined by Julian Thorne, by his wealth, his cruelty, or his name. She was Elara Vance, a mother, an artist, a survivor, a warrior. She stood, carrying her sleeping daughter to the window, and looked out at the vast, glittering expanse of the city. It no longer seemed to mock her. Instead, it felt like a canvas of infinite possibility, a world waiting to be embraced. A hopeful smile touched her lips. The storm had passed, and in its wake, a new dawn was breaking, bright and full of promise. True power, she now understood with every fiber of her being, lay not in wealth or domination, not in gilded cages or empires built on secrets. It lay in courage, in the unwavering pursuit of truth, and in the quiet, unyielding resilience of the human spirit. And Elara Vance, with her precious Aurora in her arms, was finally, truly, ready to live. So the story has ended, our wonderful friends. Are you still here at this hour? If you're truly still watching or reading right now, it means something in this story has touched your heart in some way. And maybe, just maybe, you're meant to hear what comes next. Let's look at this story from a different perspective. Not from judgment, not from blame, but from truth. There is no absolute right or wrong when it comes to the journey of healing. What Elara Vance went through was not just a courtroom drama. It was a deep unraveling of betrayal, of identity, of silence. But from that wreckage, something powerful was born. She rose, not by shouting, but by standing in truth. Not through vengeance, but through resilience. This story reminds us that healing isn't always soft. Sometimes it's fierce. Sometimes it means standing alone, shaking, and saying, "No more." Sometimes it means turning the pain into power. As Viktor Frankl once said, when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. Elara did that, not just for her, but for her child, for her future. If you're watching this and you've ever felt silenced, erased, or made to feel small, know this: your voice matters, your truth matters. And no matter how powerful the storm, you can find your dawn. So if this story resonated with you, even in a quiet, aching corner of your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that speak to the strength within us all. Remember, the end of a chapter isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's where the real story begins.